Okay, so we'll start off this lecture kind of finishing up the last couple slides from the last lecture that we hadn't really had time to get through before we start with the material and the dynamic experiments part. Um, if you remember at all from the last one, the last thing we covered here was really this sensitivity analysis where you change the parameters in your system. So you have sort of this graph where you're looking at all the possible analyses you could do, and you change the parameters or tweak the parameters and try to see how they affect the final results to understand how sensitive a given metric is to a parameter that you're looking at. And so this is how we define this sensitivity, and we can make these curves out of the data fairly easily. The next thing that we'll cover is this idea of unit testing. And again, this is just to sort of go over the principle and not necessarily learn all the ins and outs of it, because it's much more of a computer science topic than a image analysis topic, but it fits quite well with the ideas of reproducibility of the analysis that you're performing. And so basically the idea of unit testing is that you want to test every component of an analysis that you're doing. And so rather than, you have to have some way of knowing that the code you've written works. And of course, if you plan it out well, that's a good starting point, but that doesn't really ensure that you didn't make any mistakes, or that someone who goes back and changes it doesn't cause anything to be broken by what they change. And so the idea for this is that you build up little test programs which run your tool and automatically verify that the result that comes out of your tool or your analysis matches with what you'd expect from that. And so what you want to have is your application broken up into as many small little testable pieces as possible, because if you just have one giant chunk, it's very difficult to do unit testing. You can do something, you can do a different type of testing on that, and that's also important. But the main focus of unit testing is testing the individual pieces. It's possible in sort of every language, even things like 9. And most modern languages have built-in support for testing, which means they have tools that have already been developed that allow you to run it automatically and generate reports automatically that show you how the tests ran. And so kind of the idea is that you have your tools divided up into small independent pieces, so functions, and each one of these pieces can be then used independently. And so if the tests are done well, if you change something that causes the result to be wrong, immediately one of your tests will start failing. And it makes upgrading or expanding much easier, because if your tests cover every possible case that could come into your input, and you change the way a function works, so you add a more efficient way to run a calculation, then the test will make sure that this more efficient way gives you the right results as well. This idea that I mentioned before of kind of testing huge blocks is called integration testing. And the idea and this really happens once you've done the unit testing and you know all the individual pieces work, that actually the combination of these pieces works as well, and the integration or sort of glue between the different blocks doesn't cause any mistakes to be made. And so both of these are very important, but the unit tests are really the first part, and the integration tests are the second part. And sort of we have an example here. Of how this can look. And so that if you had a function that you wanted to test called count voxels, and you give this count voxel function an image, and it gives you out the number of voxels in this image. So this would be a very simple example function to test. What you would do in sort of a test-driven development setting is before you even write the function, you write the tests that it has to pass. And so if you look at large companies like Roche for their diagnostic systems, they do everything test-driven development or with a test-driven development approach, which means they don't write a single line of code for the actual function until they've written all of the tests that it needs to pass at the end. Once they've written all of the tests, then they start writing the code, and once they pass all the tests, the code's finished. And so this process is sort of very different when you compare it to the standard process that's used in science or other areas for making code. But it can be very effective because you've sort of defined at the beginning exactly what things your tools have to do. And when all of the tests pass, you know you're done. And so you sort of have a clear finishing criteria rather than having written a bunch of code first and then have to come up with all the tests and then not really knowing when exactly you're finished. This also makes it very easy, if you use the right tools, to sort of explain to someone else what functions the code has and how you are confident that it works. That if you show someone these examples, then you can say, if it's an empty 2D image, it gives 0. If it's an empty 3D image, it gives 0. If it's this identity one, it gives 3. You can also add, in many cases, sort of stochastic tests, where it will generate random sort of data sets, where you know statistically what the answer should be, and you can then make sure that over a lot of different results that the answer comes out correct. You can also have sort of hard-coded data sets inside of there. And so if you have specific structures that you know you'll be looking at frequently, you can actually load those in and make sure that you get the output on this that you expect. So now, cool. Yeah, so now this slide looks how it's supposed to look. Okay. So to sort of go with an example of how this unit testing might look, that if you go back to sort of the shape analysis or the single object shape analysis lecture, we want to generate sort of this table of results from a single image. And so we don't want to necessarily have one function like this called shape analysis, because this has many, many different pieces inside of it. And it will be kind of difficult to say which step went wrong if the table doesn't match the results that we expect. And so what we would sort of decompose this task into is the idea that sort of the first step will be a component labeling. And so that will take an input image and return a component image. The next one, or connected component labeling, the next one will be sort of analyzing individual objects. The next one, or the subtasks of the analyzing individual objects, will be then counting the voxels, calculating the center volume, calculating the shape tensor, calculating the orientation, calculating the anisotropy. And so you'll have sort of this list of tasks that you need to solve, and each one of these can be tested independently. Some of them are fairly trivial, so count voxels you probably don't need to make a test for because it's very basic, but something like calculate orientation is much easier to be confident that you have the right answer if you've made a test there, because it's really easy to simulate oriented objects. You could have a vertical rod, a horizontal rod, and make sure that they get the right numbers out. And then when you put actual data in, you're sort of confident. And when you're trying to test your function with real data or with a real image, it'll be much more difficult to see if this orientation is actually working correctly, because you don't necessarily know what the orientation is, and there's a huge variation in normal data. And then with things like the component labeling, when you do a connected component analysis, there's not really any fixed rule for which components have which label. So when you do with this analysis, you put in an input image and you have 100 cells. It actually doesn't matter which one's labeled 1 and which one's labeled 100. What you care about is that pixels inside of one component are inside of the same component in another image, but it doesn't necessarily have to have the same label. And so when you test functions like that, you're not necessarily testing that it matches 1 to 1. You're testing that it gets the right number of components out, that the average volume of the components are correct, and sort of other basic steps like that. And so what you see with this is that there's different strategies that you can take for testing each one of these. And some of them you have to think about a little bit more than other ones, because there isn't a unique deterministic output that the function will always give. particularly when you get into optimization, when you're trying to make these codes run faster, that it's very unlikely that a very optimized version of this component labeling will give you the same results as an unoptimized. But you'd expect the components that it delivers to be exactly the same. So if you look at testing, unit testing in image J, hopefully this one loads, that you can see some examples here from the actual image J code base, because they have tests built into all of the functions that they've developed in here. And these tests are automatically run before a new version of image J is released. And so this is typically how modern software companies work with tools, is they have all of these tests, and they have a machine whose only job is to make sure that every single change to the code still passes all of these tests. And if it doesn't pass all of these tests, then it won't be made into a release. And so when you have this set up, you're confident that the results that you get out of your system are right, because you know it's passed all of the tests and that no one broke something important in your tools. Of course, even for the best companies, this has problems, because if you don't make enough tests, or your tests are too simplified, then this will not sufficiently cover everything that you want to cover. And so one of the examples we have of this is from one of the guys we work with who's at Google News. They wrote all of their tests in English. And so his tests made sure that when you go to the Google News website, you get these English news, you see New York Times, this sort of setup. And they forgot to make tests for international versions, because this was his project, this was what he was working on. And so he changed something which caused all of the worldwide Google News sites to be the same and load in English, and all of his tests passed because he only tested that it was running in English. And then for about an hour, Google News was only available in English around the world because this one change was made, and his tests hadn't covered all of the possible sort of boundary conditions or looked at things like internationalization. And so his tests all passed, but the site obviously didn't work for people in Spain who were trying to get Spanish news, and they just got English news. And so coming up with these tests is not easy, but it's very important to make sure that everything works correctly, and it should not be underestimated as a task. And so here what you see for the tests that they have is, if you delete a slice, what happens, that you sort of assert after you've deleted a slice that the number of images in your stack is one less than it was before. If you have an empty stack and you try to delete a slice, you expect it to throw an error message. And if it doesn't throw an error message, then actually this test fails. This test fails. And so that's one of the important things to have in the tests as well, is when your code shouldn't work correctly, to make sure that it doesn't give a result when it should give an error message. You can go through. Most of the major open source projects have a huge amount of testing code in them. And so if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go through other projects on GitHub or Bitbucket and see what tests they've made for themselves. And they have testing tools in every language, but in MATLAB it's much newer, and you're less likely to find as much material there. But they still exist. KNIME has testing as well. You can read about it on sort of those links. And they have special nodes that are actually made for testing. And so you can make your workflow, and then you can make a special testing workflow that uses parts of it, or testing aspects of your workflow, that does things like compare the differences between an output and what you expect it to be. You can also use things like disturber nodes, which then randomly insert sort of random or missing data and are kind of used to ensure that your tool fails correctly when the input is bad. And that's one of the things that we'll see is very important with doing larger scale analyses, is that a lot of times your data will have heterogeneity or differences in it that you don't know to expect, or that you wouldn't expect in the input. And so being able to fail well is quite important. So that if you're missing too much data, it simply gives no result rather than trying to, fit a polynomial with 2 points, because that's a meaningless sort of analysis. Yeah, so test-driven programming or test-driven development is where you really define all of your tests at the very beginning, and then you write the code until all of these tests pass. And you'll see actually there's a fair number of tests that are written about how quickly something has to execute or how quickly something has to fail. So that if you're trying to make a website like Facebook, where millions of people are visiting it every hour, you want to make sure that your website loads in less than 5 or 10 milliseconds, because if it takes too long to load, then people are going to leave your website. So that's actually an important part of testing. Everything might work well, but if it takes too long or the delay's too long, then it's useless for your customers. I mean, no one wants to wait 10 seconds for the site to load, and they'll probably go do something else if it takes this long. Cool. So to kind of switch over a little bit into machine learning, and one of the later lectures will cover this in more detail, there's this really nice sort of chart that they've made for scikit-learn, which is the Python tools for machine learning. And what this has is sort of a, how do you decide what you do in sort of machine learning problems? And so this fits in with the idea of sort of validation and cross-validation and the sort of analyses that we started to mention a little bit before. And I think this sheet will help you kind of see where all those different pieces fit together as well. You probably haven't heard of a number of these different techniques, but to kind of know what's available and how they all fit in sort of the overall map is very helpful. And so you can see some of the things we've covered, like PCA, like k-means, are here. There's even k-neighbors classifier, which is then similar to this nearest neighbor that we've looked at before, but it's looking at actually sort of metrics or feature vectors rather than specific objects. But yeah, I think this chart is quite helpful for getting a feeling about how you do these kind of analyses and which tools might be relevant. This doesn't cover everything, but I think it covers a lot of the most important approaches. And you have sort of this nice note on the bottom with the tough luck if your data sets are too small or your questions are too challenging for the kind of data you're looking at. And so kind of the main categories which you see in this chart are the classification, the regression, the clustering, and the dimensionality reduction. And so those are the important kind of general categories for algorithms and tools that you have available in machine learning. And the idea is that kind of basically all of these are ultimately functions which map inputs to outputs. And so what you're mapping is sort of determined based on which category you fall into. And this also sort of determines what your output will be. And so your input could be an image, a point, a feature vector, a multi-dimensional tensor, sort of whatever falls along that. And the output, if it's a value, then you're doing regression. If it's a classification or sort of a category, then you're doing classification. If it's a group, then you're doing clustering. And so those are similar. The group is sort of more where it's not necessarily predefined before, and the classification then is. And so if a classification, you want to make sure it has the right one. In a group, you're more interested that things fall into the same group that are similar. And then finally, the last one is sort of this vector matrix tensor with fewer degrees of freedom than the input. And so this is this dimensionality reduction where you don't necessarily need to have a single value at your output because these top threes are really single pieces of information, but you want to have substantially less than you had before. And so, as we sort of mentioned a little bit in the last lecture, there's this problem with overfitting, where if you do machine learning or you do some of these approaches and you're not careful with how you do the analysis, that it's very easy to overfit. And so we sort of had this example in Python where you have this magical classifier, which is a dictionary or hash map. And basically what it does is it learns the input. It just memorizes the data that you give it, but it doesn't actually learn to classify or do anything. It just repeats what it sees. And so when you do this again, you can run it on dog and Bob, and it works perfectly. Or dog, Bob, and fish, and it works perfectly. But once you try to test it on things that aren't in the original data set, it works horribly. And so this is why you have these tools like validation, that the analysis that you're doing is sort of meaningful. And this is kind of an extension with what we were doing before, when you were looking at just the statistical analysis and these tests, is that you want to make sure that the results that you get are sort of extrapolatable to other systems. And so if you do, this is really then taking that to the next level, where you actually test to make sure that the analysis that you've done has some predictive power. And so if you do t-tests, if you do this interclass correlation coefficient, then you can be sort of confident that the analysis you did worked well on the data that you have. But if you really want to show that it will work well on new data and has sort of a predictive power, that's where it's important to kind of switch over to more of these machine learning tools rather than just the pure statistics approach. And so these fields are very well connected, but there is a sort of line at some point between them. And when you go from just looking at the data you have to trying to predict, that's kind of the major transition between these two worlds. And so the ideas for this prediction that you have are really this validation. And so what you want to do is make sure that you have run an analysis that is able to predict things about data that the analysis has never seen before. So you develop an analysis on a small data set, or a large data set, whatever you have, but not all of it. And you want to make sure that it analyzes this data set well. And so you develop it on this training data set, and you ensure that it works correctly. You then validate it on the validation data set. So you have a small piece of the data that you keep separate to make sure that once you've developed your algorithm and it works, that it actually gives correct results on this validation data set. Because otherwise you've sort of trained it on data it's seen before, and you can't really be sure that it works. And so if you blindly separate these data sets before, you can be then more confident that it will work in the end. Finally, you'll see that when you actually do validation iteratively, and so if you look at kind of the normal process that's being done, where you develop some algorithm, you then validate it, and if the validation works poorly, then you go back and change the algorithm. And once you start to do this many times, you're effectively training on your validation data set. You're not training the algorithm itself, but you're training the hyperparameter selection, or sort of your influence on the algorithm approach, so that it matches the validation set well. And so this is where kind of the last step becomes important, where you have sort of a testing data set. And the testing data set is a data set that it's the same idea as the validation. But with this, your goal is that you only analyze it, or what you're allowed to do is only analyze it once. And so once you've developed your algorithm and sort of optimized it with this validation set, so that you know it was developed on the training data and it gives very good results for the validation, then you test it on this testing data, which neither you nor the algorithm has ever seen before. And that's how you evaluate how successful your algorithm is. Because with the validation data, you can sort of optimize things so that it works really well there. But with the testing, if you're only allowed to run it once, it's sort of a one-shot result on how well your analysis works. Yeah?
Is there a way to figure out at what point the validation data has been corrupted? The validation
Yeah.
data?
I don't think so. There are ways you can sort of show for specific problems how this should be divided. So, if you looked at like the student t-test that we had, where you sort of break up where you say if it's normally distributed variable, then the likelihood that the result that you found would be randomly represented by this distributed variable you can get from these analyses. And with this validation approach, if you understand your underlying model really, really well, you can start to see that and show how many times you could actually do a validation and still have meaning. But it really depends a lot on how you are tweaking your algorithm and how you are, and what your underlying data set is. Because if let's say you develop an analysis to try to identify cells in an image, and the first time you use a Gaussian filter, it works really well on your training data, and then it doesn't work on your validation data. If the next time you use a median filter, it's unclear how much of this validation information you've incorporated into your original data set. And so if you do everything sort of algorithmically, where you say you run your validation, if your validation is low, then you make this change to your input parameter, then you could start to show how quickly your validation will be corrupted. But when you make sort of random steps and you're using your judgment to decide what the best way is, it's not really possible to show how quickly you're corrupting your validations. But you've seen in many sort of competitions and analyses where they do this, that if you've done 10 to 50 different iterations on this validation, that you might have already corrupted it at that point.
And then in practical situations, people keep multiple validation sets because you don't know how
Yeah.
much.
I mean, ideally, you have a huge amount of data,
Yeah.
and that you can keep a fairly large validation and testing set as a reserve. But it's not always possible to do it that way, and so in reality, you have to sort of make sort of trade-offs. So this idea of testing has not become so prominent in like the biological or life sciences because you simply don't have enough data to do it. And so validation is quite common, that you take a subset of your data and you make sure that the algorithm works well on that. But it still suffers from the fact that you can optimize your algorithm or optimize your training process so that it will fit the validation well. It's just you're manually optimizing it rather than having the algorithm optimize it for you. But yeah, ideally you're in a place where you have so much data that you don't need all of it in the training or most of it in the training, and so you can have lots of leftover testing and validation data to make sure it works well. Yeah?
In this case, you get to the testing point. Besides having a lot of data, you have to have a lot of data that has been perhaps analyzed with another system which you trust, than the ground truth system, or not, to be able to
Yeah.
see if the test works. So
Right. So you have to have ground truth for everything. Without ground truth, validation, neither validation nor training work at all, or testing. And so, yeah, it's a requirement of having both the data and the labels for the data so you can do something meaningful with it. But yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a clear criterion for saying that your test data is validated, is corrupted. What you see is that it works really well on your validation, and then when you run your test once, your testing step once at the end, it's really poor. And then you've corrupted your validation, or maybe your validation represented a very different group than your original training set or your testing data. So that's one of the other important concepts that comes into this idea of stratification. And so if your entire training data set is healthy patients and your validation set is sick patients, then it's actually, there's no way you could train an algorithm to recognize sick patients, or it would be very challenging to recognize sick patients if none of your training data covers the same things that your validation covers. And so particularly if you're looking at, something like 100 different samples, and your training is, let's say, 90, and your validation is 5, and your testing is 5, Then you have 5 different people in your testing group, which could be representing a very different group of your population than the 90 you had in your training. And so that's where it's important to stratify it a little bit, that if you're looking for very rare conditions, for example, that you actually have someone with this rare condition in your validation and testing, because if you don't, then you're not really even seeing if your algorithm works or not. Then you would have sort of the best validation score when you didn't never find the disease at all. And so for those aspects, the stratification is quite important. And so to kind of see a concrete example of this, if we had sort of a list of feature vectors, so we have x1 and y1, and then we have a class for each one of these points. And so here you have sort of a random sampling from it where you have these values and then the class, and it's sad and happy. It's just arbitrarily chosen data sets. And so you can graphically show this, and you can see, okay, there's the happy points, there are the sad points, and visually you can quite easily see how these fall into 2 different groups. I mean, you could draw a line fairly easily that would say, okay, these are happy points, these are sad points, but this is tricky for an algorithm to do because it's not really matching well to the coordinate space that you have. So not only is it not sort of orthogonal or in this rectangular coordinate system, it's sort of in a constantly changing coordinate system. And so if you think about very simple machine learning approaches, what they do is they go through here and say, if it's greater than 0, if x1 is greater than 0, and if y1 is greater than 0 or less than 0. So sort of this very basic idea of thresholding. And so if you try to analyze it that way, of course, you'll miss a lot of data set. And there's this cool site you can go to called TensorFlow Playground. Where you can sort of play with data sets like this yourself. So you can assemble a small neural network to try to analyze the data sets into different groups. And you can let it run and sort of get feedback on how it's working, which might be a little easier than trying to implement everything yourself. And so the first thing you can kind of do is divide the data set into these training, validation, and testing groups, sort of randomly. And here we decide for 60, 30, 10. What the split you go for really depends on what kind of data you have and how much of it you have available. But so now we have these points where it's have a class and then what data group it falls into. And then we can sort of show them here where we have the testing as sort of the circle points. I don't know if we see one there maybe, a couple other ones around. We then have the training, which are the triangles. That makes up most of the data. And then the validation, which are the squares. And so you can then use something like a decision tree, and this stuff we'll go into later. It's just about having seen something like this before, where you can then sort of graphically decide, okay, if it's less than 33, then it's sad, or if it's greater than 33, then it's sad. If it's less than 33, then check if it's less than 21. If it's less than 21, then it's happy, otherwise check. And so you can have sort of these list of instructions to follow that divide up your space well. And so you can write this out as a list where you have sort of your root. You can then say if it's greater than this value, it's, then you go on to this next node. Otherwise, you go further down the list. And then you can see sort of how the distribution between happy and sad, which are these first 2 values, change as you go further and further down the tree. So that once you get here, for example, you're 100% likely to be happy. And for one of these other nodes, here you're 100% likely to be sad after you've sort of followed those criteria. And so if you sort of overlay the data set, what this tree generated or what this tree discovered from this data, you see that it sort of matches the training fairly well. But it really doesn't work well with the validation. So you can then show the validation points here. where it completely missed them. So those are shown as sort of the large circles. And you can see that the decision tree actually had completely the wrong representation because it was trying to define this sort of spiral structure by drawing a bunch of small boxes around each other. And so this is typically kind of the major problem you have in machine learning is you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. But you don't really know what that representation is, and you use tools which work with kind of the space that you have. And so if you can't optimize this x1 and y1 to something meaningful, then you're going to have to build a very complex tree to get this to fit. Yeah. And so now if you then take it to the last point where you look at then the testing data, you can see that it does very poorly on the testing data as well. And so this would not be then a usable analysis. Of course, you normally would not look at the testing data until you've done well on the validation and want to make sure that you've actually learned the right structures. But here we just show it as an example. You can then see if you sort of give it smarter features. And so if you, rather than just saying it's x or y, if it now can be sort of squares of x and sinusoidal components, that you can start to get better decision trees out of it that are able to represent more complicated structures. So you have periodic structures rather than just boxes that you're dividing, and then you can get much closer. Boom. We didn't cover visualization last time, right? Okay. So the last thing, which is then sort of a final shift for the last lecture, is this idea of visualization. And so you'll see that with a lot of the analyses that you perform, you can very easily generate a huge amount of data, and visualizing it is very challenging. And so tables can be really difficult to interpret. 3D visualizations are very difficult to compare. So if you're looking at two 3D graphs or images, it's very challenging to say what the differences are. And you sort of have this contradictory need of trying to represent your data by a single value and to be able to explore your data and see possible trends. And so like we had with the data set before, you know, if you can look at this data visually, you can quite easily see this trend. And if you were to try to compress this into one of like the distribution metrics we had before, it would say that it's, you know, kind of evenly distributed, or the points in the center are closer together than the points at the edge. But that makes the structure that we're trying to see opaque. And so there are too many bad graphs, which kind of say my data is very complicated, which is kind of a very common message in the scientific world to see. Or I know how to use a given package of MATLAB R or Mathematica. And so these are two examples of graphs that I've recently seen that fell into this category of, you know, with a picture like this, there's absolutely no information you're getting out of it. You just see that there's a ton of points. And trying to interpret something meaningful from that huge number of points isn't easy. Here you get sort of the same result where you have, I mean, some structure potentially here, but then you just have abstract art at the end that can't really be interpreted in any meaningful way to understand what's going on. Most programs sort of by default make very poor plots. And so if you use the default settings in any tool, the plot won't really be optimized for what you're trying to do. And good visualizations take time. So here are then two more examples that you see in biology very frequently, where they're trying to map one thing to something else. And I think actually this one is from my thesis to be critical because it's a very popular graph to show sort of how the mouse genome is connected to the human genome, or where there's overlap there. And you get no information from a graph like this. I mean, you can see that there are certainly some connections, but you don't see any trends, and it would be much easier to say that there are connections but no trends, rather than wasting paper and space with such a useless graphic. Yeah?
What do we mean by good visualizations take time?
That you have to take time to think about them. Computational time is kind of irrelevant, but making sure that you've thought about what message you're trying to get across, and given time and effort to make the visualization well is important. And so if you just sort of use this default show genetic mappage function in R or in one of the R packages, you get some graph like this. And you can put it in your paper and publish it because people think this is interesting. But this graphic doesn't give you any information about the system that you're looking at. It doesn't help anyone understand what's going on.
So is it about trying to figure out which features the correlations between?
It's about thinking, I think that's what the next slide. So the key ideas that you really need to focus on are sort of what is the message? So why are you making a graphic in the first place? And this includes what features are you trying to show? You shouldn't try to show every feature if there's not really a meaning to show that. Does your graphic actually communicate the message that you're trying to get across clearly? And is a graphical representation really necessary? And so if you're trying to say there's no correlation between the mouse genome and the human genome, does a graph with points everywhere help you say this, or can you simply say there's no correlation and people will probably believe you? You don't need to actually prove it. And so to kind of extend beyond this, sort of does every line and color on your page serve a purpose? And one of the very helpful ideas, which if you read this book that's referenced at the beginning, The Grammar of Graphics, is to pretend ink is expensive. And so every piece of ink you put on the piece of paper costs you something. And so if you have sort of this visual or this approach, then you won't add a lot of excess lines and graphs to something that doesn't necessarily need it. So some of the simple rules that you can take out of it are never use 3D graphics when it can be avoided. Of course, if you're trying to be in sales or marketing and you want to lie about what you're showing, then 3D graphics can be very helpful because they don't represent the data you're looking at very well. And so if you look at something like this, which actually was in a biological paper that I read, this is a very difficult way to interpret these data sets. I mean, it works very well because the volume that you see here is in fact much larger than the percentage that it's associated with. But the percentage is based on the height, and what your eyes see is the volume. And so you overestimate how high this 62%, for example, is. That it's only this tiny piece at the top that's missing, and so maybe that's actually a much better result than it is. Pie charts can also be quite difficult to interpret well, and so typically it's best to avoid them. And background colors should almost always be white. So when you have gray or you have these other colors in the background, it can be very difficult to make out the lines, and if you pretend ink is expensive, then this is a pretty clear follow-up from that rule. Finally, this idea of color palettes adapted to human visual sensitivity. So if we go back to one of these bad graphics here, that if you look at these different colors, your eyes really focus on this yellow and this red. And what they're trying to show is simply 5 or 6 different curves on the piece of paper. And your eyes focus much more or give much more attention to that red and that yellow, even though they're not in fact more important. And so when you use default color schemes inside your tools, you will get results out that sort of don't necessarily match up with the data that you gave in. And so you want to make sure that the colors that you're using to plot have sort of an equal visual interpretation if the data sets are meant to have equal visual interpretation. Of course, if this red curve is the number of people that are dying, then you probably want to have more emphasis on that than the other data points because that might be a more relevant feature. But in general, if you want everything, if you simply have 6 different groups that you're trying to show, then you want to make sure the colors that you use for them have the same impact visually. Boom. Yeah. And so kind of the idea for this first point is, what is your message? You want to have plots that, you don't want to have plots that show the results or get a feeling for the data. a message for your results has to be much stronger. So when you think about what your message means, you're not trying to show the results or get a feeling. You're trying to show that there's a link between this parameter and this parameter. Or these two data sets are in fact very different, or something along those lines. And that's what your message needs to be. You want to focus on sort of a single, simple message. And so what's kind of the one major thing that you're trying to show? Because if you're trying to show that X and Y are correlated, but Y and Z are not really correlated, and Z has sort of a quadratic nature, and X is sort of a linear, then you can make your graphic quite messy. And it's much easier if you sort of have one or two simple messages that you're trying to focus on. And so if you're trying to show sort of X is a little bit correlated with Y, then your graph might look something like this, where you can then sort of see very clearly that's the message of the graph, and that's easy to interpret by someone just looking at it. And there's not too much extra lines or points that don't need to be there. That you've sort of conveyed what the average trend is, you've conveyed what sort of the variation is that comes into this model, sort of the uncertainty, and you've shown the different axes. The next question is sort of, does your graphic communicate it clearly? And so if you have too much data, it can be very difficult to derive a clear message from the graph that you have. And so, something, if you're trying to show this result, for example, there's too many data points that your eyes really have trouble trying to interpret that and come up with a meaningful output. And so by filtering and reducing the information that you have, you can make it much simpler. And so here, for example, we can show it by intensity. And so you see here, these are the regions where there's very few points. These are the regions where there's lots of points. And this is sort of the line that fits through them. And that's then easier for your eyes to interpret than having all of these dots here and trying to imagine, well, what would the line be, or how would that correlation actually look? Or you could show something where you show the contour lines, where you can kind of see how that structure evolves. And so depending on what, of course, your original message is, will determine how you want to represent this data. But you have a number of different ways of visualizing it based on what your input is. And with all of these graphics, if you go to the handout in the website, you can actually see the code to make all of the graphics yourself if you're interested. So this is where this idea of the grammar of graphics comes in. And so none of this is from me or inventions that I had. This all comes from this book from Tuft, where he states that sort of, languages have grammar, and you have a simple set of rules for kind of constructing sentences, or seeing if a sentence is constructed correctly. You should have the same thing for making graphics or visualizations. And so you want to have sort of, this set of rules and this way of specifying relationships and order between the things that you're trying to show. And so when you look, how does this apply to graphics? That you want to develop a consistent way for expressing this, the graphics themselves, the entire figures you make, in terms of the elements or the words in the sentence metaphor, so that you can easily decompose the graphic into its separate pieces and understand what each word or element is performing. And so you can read about all of this in these books, which are mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, and it's very helpful to kind of see how they present it, and it makes it much clearer once you've read it in more detail where this grammar comes in and how it can be used in many different situations. In R, now in Python as well, you have these toolboxes which are built up off of this grammar of graphics, which sort of use that same approach for making the graphs. And in R, it's called ggplot2. In Python, it's just called ggplot. And so basically, if you think about how you do a plot in MATLAB or Excel, that you have sort of this one function that generates your whole sentence at once. And so if you make a plot in MATLAB, you do plot, X data, Y data, color. It's the same way in Python when you use matplotlib. that you kind of give it this input and it generates everything, and then you go back and sort of fix or tweak the things that you want to change. In Excel, it's the same way. You click on a line plot and it generates everything, and then you have to tweak it afterwards. And so they produce all of the graphic at once rather than let you build it up piece by piece. And so if you kind of try to make the link to language a bit further, and this is where it gets a little bit tenuous, if you tried to speak by simply finding sentences in books that you wanted to say, it would be really difficult to speak effectively. It's much easier when you know the words and you know the grammar to build up the sentences yourself rather than copying entire sentences from somewhere else. And so that's the idea of making these plots by grammar. And the basic idea for the grammar is that you sort of have this first part, which is this data mapping. And so how do the variables that you have in your system map to spatial or color dimensions that you're looking at? And so, if you have a system with variable 1 and variable 2, then you can map variable 1 to the x-axis and variable 2 to the y-axis. Then you can sort of decide what you actually show on your plot. And so, do you show it as points? Do you show it as a line? Do you show it as some other representation? Finally, the axes and coordinate system. And so, when you have these axes, what are they actually showing? Are they linear? Are they some other transformation? Are they inverted? Is it polar coordinates? Is it rectangular coordinates? And then sort of all the labels and annotations that you add on top of this. And so you construct the graphics by focusing on each one of these different aspects independently. And if we go through, well, there's examples for that when you go back to the Grammar of Graphics site that you can look at in more detail. But basically, you assemble these graphics by thinking of them piece by piece rather than thinking about the entire thing at once. Well, so for sort of the last things that I wanted to mention, so I'm not a statistics expert by any stretch of the imagination. You have resources at ETH Zurich and Uni Zurich for consultation with statisticians for projects or research projects that you're doing. And so if you have questions or doubts about the kind of analysis that you did, it's very helpful to talk to them because this is what they do all day. And they have experience looking at this, and it doesn't cost you anything. So you can easily go to them and show them what you've done and see if you've done everything correctly or made any horrible mistakes. Unfortunately, they rarely will tell you good news. They'll usually tell you, or in many cases tell you, that what you've done actually has no significance and that you're not doing something meaningful. But at least you know that you have to do something differently, and you don't end up trying to publish results that really aren't helpful to the scientific community or aren't showing what you hope they are. The next point is sort of simulations, even very simple ones, can be very helpful. You can go to this, is it here? Anyways, where we showed before, where you kind of do this coin flip, where if you flip a coin a number of times, you can find, how likely it is that this result is statistically significant. And so you can build up simulations that match your system better to try to see if the results you have could have come up by random chance or if there's actually an underlying feature in your system that you're recognizing. Yeah, and so I think that covers it for last lecture, and so we can take a short break and then move on to the slides for this one. Unless there's any questions over those topics. Okay, so we'll take a short break.